Okay, can everyone see this screen? Lesson 4. We're going to try to see if we can get the video working because we're going to be starting with a video. So hold on a second. Before we begin, welcome everyone to class number 4 in our 6-part series, Journey of the Soul. We began with lesson 1 discussing the very nature of life and how we identify the meaning of what life is and who we are. And we took that journey through our perspective on how we view life, and then how we can discuss the nature of what happens after life. In lesson number 2, we discussed our relationship with those who have passed on. Last week, we dealt primarily with the process of mourning, of the Shiva, of the Shloshim, of grief and consolation, of discussing the reality of what goes on with the soul and the body after they separate from each other, and the feelings of those departed and those who are mourning, and the etiquette and the purpose of the mourning ritual in Judaism, that it's a double-pronged, dual purpose. One is that it's meant for us to engage functionally and also have a relationship, a connection with those who have passed, that we can do both at the same time, and that how we maintain a relationship, a connection, by visiting the resting place, by engaging in study and Torah and good deeds in memory of the individual. And this way we have a tangible connection with them even after they're gone. And at the same time, learning how to balance our purpose here while recognizing that even though the afterlife is another journey, it's not the end of one life, the beginning of another, but it's a segue, it's a transition into another form of life, and not something to be afraid of. Nevertheless, we must adequately capitalize on the opportunities that we have here in our world, because only in this world can one achieve, through the unity of the body and soul, the purpose of the mission of why we were here, and recognize that we are all mission-oriented individuals, that everyone who comes into this world is here for a purpose and a mission. Some missions are longer, some missions are shorter. There is no such thing as unfinished. As long as we are here, we are fulfilling a mission. Tonight, and again, these classes obviously are recorded. People can go back and listen and study them some more. There is so much material, and it's really even more to discuss that we don't always have the time. But tonight's class will deal with one of the most misunderstood but most curious for most people about what happens after we leave this world. Notions of the afterlife, heaven, hell, what really happens after we leave the reality that we recognize. Is there such a thing as heaven? Is there such a thing as hell? Have we just borrowed these terms from others, or have they borrowed it from Judaism? What does Judaism have to say about what happens in the afterlife, and how do we know with any certainty if no one has ever come back to tell us what goes on? I'm going to begin with a video that illustrates a parable of why it is that we can engage in this conversation in the outset, because in truth, we've all been through this process. We are just not aware of it. And such that when we are born, we are actually transitioning from one form of life to another. While we are in utero, we are in one form of life, not able to imagine what the type of life will be after. But when we emerge into this world, we actually disengage from one form of life where we are dependent on our mothers, where we are attached to our mothers, literally with an umbilical cord, our nutrition, everything that comes through. We are sustained through that relationship. And when we emerge into this world, we are expelled and we are pushed out against our will, crying, screaming into a new reality, recognizing that in order to go from one reality to another, we have to leave behind. There has got to be a separation. The separation is necessary. As traumatic and as painful as it is, it opens the doors to a whole new reality that we could have not envisioned before. That is the very purpose of why we went through the pregnancy in the first place. This is really a very profound way of understanding why it is not to fear and not to get trapped in the mystery of how do we know, and being held back by the unknown and what the fearful of the unknown, but recognizing that every transition, as we discussed in a number of classes, always is a fearful undertaking until we get through that portal where we realize that there was no other way to go through this process other than that. And so this is a very, very interesting conversation that takes place in utero between two babies, twins, having a discussion. So let me see if we can get this going here. Why this is freezing here for 1 second. Are you able to hear, Rosemary? Can you hear? Okay.
Birth and death are as contradictory as night and light. But they are strangely associated with an identical Hebrew word, kever. Kever means a tomb where a body is buried. But kever also means a womb where life is formed. A womb is a gateway to life, while a tomb is a gateway to afterlife. But is there an afterlife? Or does laying a body to rest in a grave mark the absolute end? If it were within our power to interview a soul, we would undoubtedly glean insight into afterlife. Instead, we have chosen to eavesdrop on a set of twins in their mother's womb to shed some light on the before life.
Hey, twin, I'm scared of birth.
Why?
It's the end of existence. We get ejected. We're finished.
I'm also anxious, twin, but I'm not scared. Birth is supposed to be a transition to the real life.
Huh. Don't give me the hiccups with your after-birth real-life fantasies. How can life be supported without an umbilical cord and amniotic fluid?
Well, maybe it's a radically different form of life. Maybe we won't need the cord.
I wish you were right. I keep kicking that thing away from my neck.
Stop spinning for a minute and imagine, twin. After birth, we will enter a ginormous universe filled with light and with air that we will breathe through our mouths.
Come on, grow some brain cells, will you? Mouths are not for breathing. Besides, if your postnatal paradise existed, why has no one ever returned from that realm? Forget it. Once we leave here, we collapse into cold, dry nothingness and wither into eternal gloom.
I don't think Mother would allow that to happen. She nurtures us in this cozy womb. She sends us nutrients for months on end. For what purpose? Just to end it all with birth? No. Mother has greater plans for us than that.
Now you're beginning to sound infantile. Do you see a mother lurking in some corner of the womb? Not a trace. Show me a mother. And as for your nutrients, can't you feel that annoying cord? Don't exchange empirical for fantastical.
Thankfully, these two delightful infants made it safely to the other side. They grew up in the universe that one had described and the other had denied. And until today, they continue their clamorous debate. It is only that the topic of contention has slightly shifted from, is there life after the womb, to, is there life after the tomb?
Okay, thank you. Were you able to hear it well? Okay. So the point of this, that animated short video was to illustrate something very profound as we begin here tonight, and that is that, number one, it is impossible for human beings to conceive of something that is so beyond our ability to experience now to try to conjecture what it's like on the other side. We are trying to have a conversation about whether there is an afterlife and what it's like, but since it seems so far removed from our present reality, it is almost impossible for us to imagine that something like that exists because we are so entrenched in the here and now, and what's empirical, what we can feel, touch through our five senses is what's real. Everything else is in the world of the fantastic. But as the video illustrates, before we are born, we are engaging in that same conversation. If we were able to have a conversation with ourselves in utero, do you think an infant can imagine that it can exist on the outside, not being attached by a cord, not being safely ensconced in that womb, and that it can actually transition and that there's another form of life after those 9 months that is even more blissful, or that is even more purposeful or more productive, and that going through the 9 months in the womb is merely a gestational period of time to prepare ourselves for that process? If we can use that as a metaphor, it allows us to more easily assimilate this idea that perhaps all of life is really a process of preparing ourselves, like in a cocoon of the caterpillar, that when we emerge on the other side, we're emerging in a totally different existence. But that existence, no matter, even though we can't imagine it now, is merely another phase of a process that was always meant to be from the very beginning. If that is the case, then it takes away some of the fear, the unknown, and the tension around it, because just because we've never seen it, just because we can't imagine the details about it, doesn't mean that it isn't real and that it isn't even logical. Number one. Number two, that everything that happens in the afterlife is a direct result of what happens in this world, and that we are actually born twice. We are born once from the womb, and then we are reborn again from the tomb. And so all of us go through two parts, two births. And it's interesting, it occurs to me now, that for many years, I always wondered what the Talmud was trying to illustrate with this proof. The Talmud in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, where it discusses the resurrection and what's going to happen in the afterlife, the Talmud asks, how do we know for sure that we can come back again and live again, that there will be a resurrection, and that there is an afterlife? And the Talmud gives many answers, but one of the answers the Talmud gives is that it's actually fairly logical. Every day, the Talmud says, babies who have never lived are born. Why can't people who have lived once before live again? If human beings who have demonstrated that they can live once, why can't they prove it again? No one ever questions that an infant who has never proven that they can survive on this planet. We take for granted that babies will be born every single day, and they will live. They come from the other world and they are born. But someone who has actually proven, has a track record of actually having lived once, the Talmud says, it's even more logical that they should be able to come back and live again. They've done it. They have experience. And I always used to wonder, what is the Talmud really saying? Why does the Talmud use that as a logical example? It actually is not, it's counterintuitive. It doesn't really make sense. It's not proving anything, that just because babies are born, that therefore people who have died infirm and of old age and when their body has decayed should be able to come back. And it occurs to me that what the Talmud really is trying to say is that we are all born twice. The first time we come into this world that we are born is merely stage one. So we have to stop believing that we come into this world just once, and then when we leave, it's sayonara for good. What happens here is that we come from the womb into this world, we go back into a system of an embryonic stage, back into the earth, of which we will then emerge a second time. As the video tells us, the Hebrew word for kever is the same for womb and tomb. How ironic. And so, if we understand that we are born twice, once from the womb, and then once again from the tomb, these are not just rhymes, but these are intrinsically connected to each other, then we recognize that just because conceptually it's an idea that is hard to grasp in our minds now, it doesn't make it any less real. As a matter of fact, it's the reverse. We never would have imagined before we are born that life, the way we inhabit today, is normal, that we can exist, that a baby in utero only can imagine life as it is at that moment. So too, we can't imagine going back to where we came from. No human being can imagine going back. We can only imagine where we are now. Which leads us ultimately to what's going to be the main topic of tonight, and that is, once we can establish and accept that there is a fairly strong reason to maintain that we are born and then reborn again, and that Jews can be very comfortable walking around using terms like being born again, and we don't have to we don't have to stand down and give up on this idea that we are all born again. All of us are going to be born again, because life right now is stage one, and then life afterwards is stage two. And it's not something that only one person or a handful of people are going to experience, but all of us. Then we have to ask ourselves, then what is the function? What is the purpose? What happens in that time between we leave this existence and then we come and the afterlife and then we come back? What is happening? What is its function? Is there such a thing as heaven? Is there such a thing as hell? Is it true that there is reward and punishment in the afterlife? What do those things really mean? Why would God care so much about what we do in this world, whether we do or we don't? How does it actually impact anything in the world of truth? And so we're going to begin with some very axiomatic principles of Jewish philosophy. Maimonides teaches us, and many of you are familiar, that in the morning prayers, after the Aleinu, many Jews throughout the world every day recite what is known as the Yud Gimel Ikarim, the 13 principles of faith. 13 principles of faith, as quoted by Maimonides, encapsulates the main articles of what it means to be a Jew, what we believe in. And he goes on to say that if any Jew denies even one of these 13, it's not that they're denying one aspect of Judaism or one principle, they are denying the very, very foundation. They're denying all of Judaism, going back to Moses and Mount Sinai. They're denying the entire Torah. So The 11th of the 13th is that we believe that God blessed be he, rewards those who observe the commandments of the Torah and will punish those who transgress its prohibitions. There is no Judaism as we know it. There is no Torah and mitzvot without affirming this principle that there is schar and onish. There is reward and punishment, that our actions in this world do have consequence. They are real. And what happens in this world is not a make-believe fantasy. It's not a cartoon that we just take up some time before we go into the next world. And it doesn't really matter what happened. But of course, that everything that happens in this world is going to affect and determine what happens in our afterlife. You see, one of the theologically complex ideas to explain is why is it that in the Torah does not give us the promise of spiritual reward for doing the mitzvot of the Torah. There are several examples in the Torah where the Torah tells us the physical reward that we will receive. For example, for honoring our parents, it says that we will live a long life. For being compassionate and merciful, even to creatures, to birds, not even to non-humans, we will live a long life. But we do not find the Torah giving us what the spiritual reward is. And if the spiritual reward is primary, why does the Torah not tell us about this idea? Number one. Number two, it's obvious that these rewards come in both physical and spiritual. But as Maimonides points out again, that just like it's impossible for a human being to imagine a reality that we've never experienced, it's also impossible for a human being to imagine pleasure, reward that is abstract. So in other words, if I were to ask you, if you were to take a poll or a survey and ask you to rate from 1 to 10 the degree of pleasure that something provides for you, okay? I'll give you a list. So imagine we were doing this exercise, and I would say, give a number to this reaction, a visceral reaction of what would give you pleasure. Happiness, lifetime of meaning. How about great wealth? How about a 3-week cruise in the Hawaiian Islands? How about wisdom? How about love? How about a lifetime membership to the most exclusive country club in the world? When we try to deconstruct what a number of what gives us happiness or pleasure, conceptually, many of us may give numbers to more abstract ideas, but the average person can relate much more to a physical form of pleasure. So yes, ideas of meaning, wisdom, love, we know conceptually are the most important. But if we were asking what gives you pleasure, can you say that wisdom is a 10 out of 10 in the same way that physical happiness or going on vacation or getting a brand new car gives you that immediate response? Why is that? Because while we may in our mind recognize that there are pleasures that far surpass temporary physical pleasures, because it's very hard for us to relate to them physically, they don't have the same empirical way for us to measure them versus things that we can measure in our life. We know what things that give us pleasure physically. It's hard for us to quantify spiritual pleasure. As such, in the same way that it's hard to have, it's difficult to have a discussion about what happens in the afterlife, to discuss what a spiritual reward would mean that a human being in a physical body would have to try to hypothesize what that level of pleasure is, whether it's meaningful, and how does it compare? We'd be comparing it to, the most pleasurable experience we've had in our life. But the truth is that they are not that they are not equal. They are not within the same realm. We can't talk about them in the same way. And as such, since the Torah is talking to us souls within a human body, the Torah does not give us ideas that are beyond the realm of the human mind and the human experience to comprehend and to be able to quantify. Therefore, we have to recognize, as Maimonides tells us, that the greatest reward that exists is the world in the afterlife, and the harshest punishment is what happens in the afterlife. Because, again, if we recognize that eternity and the truth of the transition is what happens, then certainly, because we can't understand it, that's why we know it's so much more profound and so much more powerful, because we cannot wrap our minds totally around it. It's not a temporary, ephemeral pleasure response. In other words, whenever the Torah discusses reward, it's primarily discussing reward after we leave this world. When the Torah is discussing punishment, it's discussing punishments in the afterworld, where though all of those are much, much more intense, because they are spiritual ideas, not physical ones. While it is true that sometimes we experience physical reward and physical punishment in this life as well, and Maimonides explains they are tangential to the experience, but they are not primary. And that's why we find, we don't have to look very far, there are very, very righteous people who observe all the mitzvot, who don't necessarily experience physical reward. And there are many people who are on the opposite, who seem to reap tremendous physical pleasure, not without leading moral, ethical lives. The commentaries have long discussed this paradox and explaining that in many ways, what is happening here is that since no deed goes unpunished and no good deed goes unrewarded, what many times happens is someone whose primary focus in life is on physical, and they've disenfranchised themselves from the afterlife, will get their entire reward in this world, which is limited and temporary, because it will allay the idea that this soul will have to be rewarded with something that is truly infinite in the other world. And that's why the great sages throughout history never wanted to really get reward in this world, because they always knew that if they're getting a special reward in physical terms, it must mean in their minds that there is something that has to get paid back in this world, because it's the act is commensurate with the response, with the reward. And this is a crucial thing I want to discuss before we move on to the next idea, because one of the main flows of tonight's class is going to be recognizing that we are conditioned to think of cause and effect. So I do something and then there is an effect, or there's crime and consequence. Kabbalah teaches us that in truth, it's not like you do something and then you get a reward for it, or you do something wrong and you get punished for it. It's actually much more, it's much more, the causation is much more direct. And that is, when we do something good, there's a flow that flows directly from it. That's a direct cause of the action. When we do something wrong, the effect is what we've done. It's not that there's a response that because I did this, that's why I'm getting punished. It's like saying that if you put your finger in a fire and you get burnt, that's a punishment for putting your hand in a fire. No, that's not a punishment. It's a direct cause of putting your finger in a flame that you get burnt is your action. Your action causes it. Not that there's a delayed reaction that because you did it, you're going to be punished for what you did. This is an important idea because let's look at two scenarios, okay, of how much of the world, and even in many ways in classic Judaism, how people understood this idea of reward and punishment, and why it's something that I want to deconstruct, because to give us a different idea of how to engage with it. I'm going to read you a text from Rabbi Menachem Recanati. He was a rabbi who lived in 13th century Italy. He was a great philosopher and Kabbalist. He wrote a number of different important works that are still studied today, commentaries on the Torah. He lived in the mid-1200s. And this is what he writes. He says, do not consider the punishments that are described in the Torah as comparable to penalties that a person incurs for disobeying the decree of a mortal individual or a king. Not at all, he says. Rather, they are completely natural consequences. For one who fails to observe a Torah commandment is denied the good that naturally results from its observance. He says it's comparable to one who fails to plow and sow his field and therefore cannot reap a harvest, or one who fails to wear clothes and then is cold. It is as natural a consequence as the warmth provided by fire, the wetness of water, the satiation of bread. In the same way, it is the nature of each mitzvah to provide the positive consequences that are promised for its observance or the negative consequences that are stated regarding its transgression. Let us try to understand in layman's terms what he's saying. Let's look at two examples, my friends, okay? So if you look at your screen, there are two scenarios of how we would understand cause and effect in life, or action and consequence. I would call them either direct cause or delayed reaction, okay? For example, let's imagine a human being, a business person, someone who works for a living. You go to work, at the end of the week, you get a paycheck, you get compensated for your work. With that paycheck, you go and you purchase food, right? And you support yourself and your family. What is that formula? The formula is I work, I am remunerated, I am compensated with money, and with that money, I go buy food to sustain myself. Scenario number two, okay, so let's look at, if you look at your screen, this is the progression of option A, okay? Work, money, food. Option number two, you're a farmer, or you have a little garden in your backyard or on your windowsill, and you plant something, you reap food. What is the difference? The difference in simple English, my friends, is that really there's no intrinsic connection between the different stages of working for something, earning compensation, because those things are not automatic. They don't necessarily always equal. For example, there are many people who do work and are not always compensated or compensated fairly. A person can conceivably work and not be reimbursed. So it is also true that money does not always equal food, whether enough, or you can take that money and use it for something else. You don't have to use it for food. It's not an automatic consequence. Those three things are divorced from each other conceptually. It's the human being we bring these things together because in our minds, those three things are related. I go to work so I can earn money, so that with that money I can go to the supermarket. But each of these things are independent. They're not necessarily intrinsically related to each other. In the second scenario, though, that is on your screen, there is actually an intrinsic connection between sowing, reaping, and food. It's not a harvest. Reaping of food is not your payment for sowing. It is a directly generated consequence, right? A equals B equals C. What I am doing has a direct result as I move through the screen. A, B, C. I skip one part, I lose, the whole thing tumbles down, right? But in scenario A, someone else can give me money to go buy food. I can be compensated for not doing work, as many CEOs will gladly tell you it happens to them all the time. And there are people who do lots of good work and don't get compensated. They're not necessarily related to each other. So what is the Rabbi Recanati, the great Italian sage, telling us? That we should understand that reward and punishment is not a conventional idea the way it is in scenario A, where I do something, and then because I've done it, there is an outside force that judges it, evaluates it, and then determines what form of reward or punishment is going to be administered. Or someone to decide, what is my work worth? What type of remuneration am I going to be? Or the money that I earn, in one supermarket, I can get so many bags of food, but if I go to Whole Foods, I'm going to walk out with a lot less. It's arbitrary, right? There isn't an intrinsic value to any of those things. But in our scenario here, what he's trying to tell us is that when we do something, it creates a flow, it creates a consequence that is a direct result of what we do. There isn't a process of evaluation. There isn't a process where if I do it and you do it, there may be different responses. What we do is exactly what we are reaping, what is coming back. Okay. Now, once we've established this, I know many of you, an obvious question that people ask, and they ask me this all the time. They say, Rabbi, if that is true, that automatically, if I do a mitzvah, that means it should generate a positive response. And if I do an avera, a transgression, it should automatically generate a negative response. Why is it that it doesn't always happen the way you are saying? If you're saying that it's not a delayed reaction, it's not a third party or even God determining what should be the consequence, but what I am doing is as simple as A equals B equals C, that a mitzvah creates goodness and a transgression, the response is as simple as putting my finger in fire and getting burnt is not a punishment, it's a direct cause of what I've done. Then why is it that we don't find it true in everyday life? Obviously, this is something that for thousands of years our rabbis have been discussing. And just to share with you a couple of ideas, and that is that while ostensibly what I've said just now is true, nobody disagrees with this. The truth is that in our limited understanding, we don't always understand why it is that there is a disconnect between the spirit and the physical, and that while sometimes, even though you're doing the right thing, there isn't an immediate reaction that is obvious to us why I'm getting that different reaction than I should be getting. I would compare it to actually similar to a doctor tells you that you should eat a certain diet to stay healthy, right? So we know that eating healthy will give a person the best shot of having a healthy diet, gives you the best shot of living a healthy life, correct? Now, is it true that every person who eats a healthy diet lives a long life and never goes to the doctor? Devin, I'm talking to you. Is every vegan guaranteed to live to 120 because they're eating a healthy lifestyle? Of course not. There are many other factors that go into it that would cause sometimes people who lead unhealthy lifestyles to live longer or to, for whatever reason, than people who don't. But no one will ever say that it certainly doesn't make sense to say that just because that is true, then I'm not going, what's the point of having a healthy diet if anyway I can get hit by a car tomorrow, God forbid, or I can get cancer, God forbid, or I can contract COVID, God forbid, and then eating a vegan raw diet will have done me no good. Not only will I have suffered all those years in vain, why not enjoy life if none of those things are guaranteed anyway? Obviously, those things are nonsensical because the exception obviously proves the rule. And that is, generally speaking, that is true. But we don't always understand. We don't know. It's not always true that by following this rule, you're always going to get this result. Nevertheless, we do it anyway. Why? Because we understand that it gives us the best chance at it. So too, there's a normal procedure to how God set up this world, that a good spiritual life should always result in living a good physical life too. But we live in a world of concealment. This world is concealed. This world is a world that's shrouded in mystery. And that is why, just because we don't always see the consequence, we don't always see the result, doesn't mean that it's not there. The Rebbe always used to use the metaphor about that blessings are like rain. You know that it can rain, and on one place it rains and something grows, and on the same street down the block it rains and nothing grows. Why is that? Because in order for something to grow, before it rains, you have to go through a process of tilling the soil, turning it over, putting in fertilizer, preparing it. So when it rains, there is something waiting for it. Someone who just says, I'm going to put out a piece of concrete and I want things to grow, it's going to rain and rain and rain and nothing's going to happen. The same is true of blessings that come from the spiritual worlds. God is always sending in blessing to us, but not always are we tillable material. Sometimes we are these arid soils getting all this nourishment, but the truth is that nothing is transforming, nothing is happening to us because we are not adequately prepared before. You know, it's similar to having an experience in synagogue. People say, Rabbi, I go to shul, I don't feel anything, right? Well, I say, listen, you know, shul is not necessarily going to transform you automatically if you just show up and sit down and cross your arms and wait for the rain to come to inspire you, right? Maybe sometimes if it's an extraordinary sermon, if it's a good joke, if it's a powerful haftorah, if there's something meaningful going on in your life, if it's Yom Kippur, right? These are moments. But for the average person, before you go to shul, you have to get up in the morning and say to yourself, why am I going to shul? What do I hope to get out of this experience? When I will be there, am I going to be open? Am I opening myself up that when something happens, I'm accepting the rain? Or the rain can hit me, but it'll roll right off my shoulder like concrete because I'm sitting there like a piece of rock. In the same sense is, two people can be sitting right next to each other. They're both getting the same blessing, the same flow, spiritual flow, but the work that you put in before determines what you're going to get out of it. That is what life, that's true of physical and spiritual life. My friends, you know, how appropriate. We're less than a month from Pesach. I always have this conversation. We always have this conversation. There are some people who groan. They go, "Oh, it's almost Pesach. So hard. So much cleaning. Ay," right? We hear all the ayes. And then there are people who say, "I can't wait for the opportunity to experience Pesach, that this is the opportunity to open." And the truth is that to the degree that we're going to prepare, that's that in many ways determines what the experience of Pesach is. If you come into Pesach without preparing for Pesach, then Pesach can come and Passover can go. But people who spend time before, not just physically cleaning, but recognizing the transformative time of Pesach, when you sit down by the Seder, it has a whole different experience. Why? Because the whole notion of meditation and putting spiritual focus in something is creating that opportunity that when it comes, I am present for it. So we went around this long way of explaining that just because I don't feel the love for doing a mitzvah, doesn't mean that love wasn't being sent. Just because I don't feel the blessing, doesn't mean that the blessing isn't there. It has a lot to do with our antennae, our emotion, as our soul. Are we open? Do we want to feel? Do we want to be engaged? Many people don't want to be engaged because they're afraid of what that consequence may be. If I open myself up, I'm vulnerable. It's like relationships, right? If I open myself up, do I want to feel that feeling of love? Because what is it going to ask of me in return? If I'm going to feel God's love, I may have to reciprocate. That's very scary. And so getting back to our conversation, when we talk, because the point here is to discuss how we can anticipate what's going to happen after we leave this world. What happens in the afterlife? Should we be afraid of what we call hell? And what is heaven? So let's get into those definitions now. Many people are afraid of what those things mean, because when we hear the word hell, right away we imagine a fiery place, from whether it's books, movies, or other associations. We imagine hell with something with horns, mixing a brew, and giving us this welcome to hell, and we've been waiting for you for 100 years. But the truth is that the world that we go to is very much predetermined by our actions in our life. That is the world that is anticipating us. Please, let's look closely at this video here as well.
Today's reflection meditation is going to help us begin to appreciate the massive influence that we have by performing one small deed here in this physical world while our souls are in bodies. There's somewhat of a paradox. On one hand, you see, we know that the physical world is just the tip of the iceberg. It's just one layer or level of reality, and that there is so much more to reality behind, in back of this veneer that we see, the physical world that we see. There are spiritual worlds behind spiritual worlds, behind spiritual worlds. And yet, at the same time, we know that what we do in this lowest world, in the physical world, has repercussions in the highest heavens. How do we wrap our minds around that paradox? That on one hand, we're in the lowest world, and on the other hand, we are affecting what goes on in spiritual realms. So the reflection that will help us with this is the visualization of a metaphor. Very simple metaphor. Imagine, if you will, a lever. What's a lever? A lever is basically two things. It's a stick and a wedge. You put the stick on the wedge, called the fulcrum, and you can lift things much bigger than you could without the lever. Now imagine you're lifting a big boulder, let's say. If you have a long enough lever, It's possible. Now, when you are moving the long side of the stick, think about the fact that when you're moving that end just a little bit, it's causing massive fluctuations on the other end. That's like our world. On one hand, we're very far away from the fulcrum, but it's precisely because we're far away, then little movements on this end cause massive movements on the other end. Try to imagine yourself doing a mitzvah, a physical act. Something small in that it lasts for a moment. It takes place in one specific location. In that sense, it's small. And now imagine how that small movement is really moving the long side of the stick, the long side of the lever. Imagine how your small movement here in this world is causing massive movements in the heavens. We'll take a moment to visualize and to try to feel the leverage, the power that our small actions have.
Okay. We spent a lot of time getting to this through this intro, and so because it's crucial to understanding this next stage. My friends, most of you, the purpose of this meditation was to recognize how small acts here while we are here cause tremendous vibration in the afterlife and in the next world of where we're going. Because the paradox is, why is it that something so insignificant that we do here should have so much effect in the next world? And so, my friends, our sages tell us that the way to understand what the nature of heaven and hell and what's awaiting us is by recognizing the way we live our life with directly proportionate to our passion, of which we have passion in this world for negativity. That's the fire, so to speak, of hell that's awaiting for us in the afterlife. The tremendous passion that we invest in performance of God's commandments in this world also will dictate the delight that we will have corresponding waiting for us in the afterworld as well. We've all heard the term in Hebrew called Gehenna. How many of you have heard the term Gehenna? Gehenna is the classic Hebrew term for hell. What does Gehenna mean? Where does it come from? Why was that term chosen? And what is the true definition of hell in Judaism? The term Gehenna actually comes from the Bible. It's actually not pronounced Gehenna, it's pronounced Gehinom. Gehinom, two words, was a place that's mentioned in the land of Israel. It's a valley that borders just outside Jerusalem. It was known as the valley. Gay is a valley of Hinnom, the valley of the Hinnom. It's mentioned in the book of Yehoshua, of Joshua, in the Tanakh. It's a place where tragically Jewish people worshipped idolatry and even sacrificed their own children to pagan gods. It was a very inhumane, tragic form of idolatry called Molech. Molech, we are warned in the Torah not to hand our children over to this god Molech. It was the pagan Canaanites who introduced this to our ancestors, where they would actually offer their own children to this pagan god. The prophets, Jeremiah prophesies that the Gehinnom will become a place of great killing and a place of tremendous punishment where the wicked will receive their punishment. And from there, because this was a place of such tragedy, such inhumanity, such callous disregard of parents to their own children, This was seen as the ultimate idea of hell. That hell is where parents turn their back on their own children, where a place that's so close to Jerusalem can be transformed into a place that of idolatry, of paganism, of child molestation, and where eventually tremendous plague and a tremendous devastation of the Jewish people occurred. This is the source, the original biblical source of Gehenna, Gehinnom. It was used throughout history as a physical place in Israel of where ultimate retribution took place, where the comeuppance of the greatest evil would be addressed in this valley right here. A better description of what hell means in Judaism, though, is not Gehenna, is not hell. Rather, what we would call soul rehabilitation or soul catharsis, because the purpose of what happens in the afterlife is that no soul ever goes to a place of eternal damnation or punishment. It goes through a process of several months, but generally no more than 1 year of rehab. And after rehab, all souls enter what we call paradise or Gan Eden. Okay, so let's go through these terms and explain what this means. What happens in the afterlife when our soul goes into this experience is that it experiences the negative effects of its actions. It goes through a process of cleansing. And it is the soul recognizing the consequence and the shame of its own actions. Looking in the mirror is what the process of what we call Gehenna really is. Our sages tell us that the maximum sentence of when a soul leaves this world is 12 months. Sincere teshuvah, that of repentance, it ultimately can cleanse even the most serious of transgressions. And that is why for the first 12 months after a passing of someone, we say the Kaddish, we say prayers, we light a candle, we read from the Torah in memory of that person, because our sages tell us that the maximum sentence of a soul going through rehab or going through a cleansing to rectify, and actually in Kabbalah it uses even more, a more direct metaphor, and that is that just like when precious metals, because technically we understand that a soul cannot become sullied. How can a neshama, how can a soul become damaged? How can it become affected by sin if it's a spiritual entity? The answer is that while it lives in life within the body, it collects dust, it collects dirt that attaches itself through life. It picks up impurities that have to be cleansed. And if you've ever watched a goldsmith or a silversmith, how they remove the impurities from precious metals, they hold it to a fire and they burn away the impurity to remove the dirt, the blemish, and to make it pristine again. It is this metaphor where fire comes from in Judaism regarding Gehenna, and that is that the soul is made to feel tremendous pressure. But the purpose of it is to remove, because the soul is a piece of gold. The soul is pure. But what the soul is not being punished, the soul is going through a cleansing to disassociate from it all the impurities that it picked up during life that cleaved and became attached to it. Now, for most people, Kabbalah says it can be anywhere from 2 to 3 months up to 6 months. For the most serious transgressors, it is a maximum of 12 months. That is why we stop saying Kaddish after the first year when someone passes away, because otherwise, really, we should. I know it would be a tremendous inconvenience for some people, but otherwise, we would never stop saying Kaddish. If we believe that the soul is constantly being judged and going through this process, then we'd have to say Kaddish for our entire lifetimes for people. But we only say Kaddish for the first year, and then subsequently on the yurt site, because each year on the yurt site, the soul goes through another reckoning, and it goes through a special, on each anniversary, it goes to a different level, which is why Kaddish is said again. When we do a mitzvah, we are forging an intimate bond. The paradise is the experience of this depth of this relationship, that the soul feels connected to those below, and we feel connected to those above. Now, aside from the truth, I also want to mention that there are some psychological and emotional benefits. Studies have shown that with a wide-ranging, they've done a study where the effects of spiritual and religious beliefs on death and bereavement. They did in 2007 a review of 32 scientific studies that were published between 1990 and 2005, containing data on several thousand people who have suffered the loss of a loved one. And they came up from these 32 studies, 22 studies reported positive effects of spiritual and religious beliefs on bereavement. 6 studies reported limited positive effects, 2 reported no, and 1 studied some negative. In other words, 94% of all the studies done with people who have suffered loss recognize that when we do something actively to engage and connect, it not only, as I'm illustrating, it has a real effect on the soul, but it has a positive effect on the person, on the survivor, knowing that they can be engaged and do something proactive and positive for the elevation of the soul. And it has a psychological and emotional benefit. Now, while that's true, that would not be the reason to do it. It's not the purpose, not to make us feel good, but knowing, like all things, as the Torah says, that when we do something good, there is a material benefit and a spiritual benefit, allows us to better recognize and feel that it's not an either or. Just like when we do a mitzvah, we said earlier that there is a material benefit, but the real benefit is the eternal spiritual pleasure that we cannot even conceptualize in this world. So too, the Torah gives us a way to connect with those who have passed on. When we say Kaddish, when we give charity in memory of someone, when we go to synagogue 4 times a year and say Yizkar, when all the elements, when we light a candle, the numerous interplay the Torah gives us and tells us that we can constantly do something in memory of someone, it has a tangible material benefit for us. Of course, it has a much bigger benefit for the soul. We don't even recognize, we can't even imagine. But knowing what it does for us allows us to also realize that it's not, that the Torah gives us a multitude of points of connection. Because in paradise, the neshama, the soul, is in a constant state of progressive elevation. It's not static. Just like life on this world is not static. We don't just enter the next world and then float. We're not in a world of nothing. The soul is constantly going through one level and another level. As the Talmud says, there are myriad of levels where the soul is constantly being elevated higher and higher. And every time we do something, a mitzvah, for the soul, we are helping it. So because you see, in heaven, souls can study Torah too. In heaven, they study Torah. In heaven, there exists spirituality. But the one thing that does not exist in heaven is the ability to do physical mitzvah. And that's why, even though it's so important to study Torah for someone on the yard site, we gather, we read Torah together. The most important thing our sages tell us to do for someone who has passed on is an act of a mitzvah, because the physical act is something the soul cannot achieve on its own without you. You can study. The soul is aware of Torah and studies Torah too. Moses, Aaron, Rashi, Rambam, they're all studying Torah. Rabbi Akiva, there's a huge Torah study session, jam session taking place. But what they cannot achieve is acts of kindness. They cannot do a mitzvah. They cannot observe physically. They cannot light candles for Shabbat. That they need us to do for them, and that creates that bond. As I mentioned earlier, while this is true for the first year, every yahrzeit on the anniversary, the soul experiences a quantum leap, even though the soul is constantly going through change and elevation throughout every day. We gather on yahrzeits because we recognize that there's something that happens on that day that, just like a birthday in our lives here, is a momentous day for change, for resolution, for reflection. So too, the yahrzeit is the same true even after we leave this world as well. We have two birthdays. Just like I mentioned, we said in the beginning, we have two births. We birth from the womb and a birth from the tomb. We have two birthdays. We have the birthday where we are born. We have the birthday when we leave this world. Our yahrzeit is also a day of tremendous self-reflection and connection. So I said before that the maximum is 12 months. The Talmud tells us in the Tractate of Sanhedrin that ultimately every single person ends up, all of us, eventually end up in the world to come, no matter what. So we are all going to end up in heaven and Gan Eden regardless. There is no such thing as eternal hell, because after 12 months, everyone goes in. Now the question is are there cases of people who go for longer than 12 months? How is that possible? What about people who are so evil? Or what about people that are so pure? Does everybody have to go through a process of hell? I'm using the English term, but what we call Gehenna, but the process of rehabilitation of the soul. And so the answer is that many souls never even go through the process of cleansing. They go straight into Gan Eden. Again, the majority of people, according to most of the commentaries, will be anywhere from 2 to 6 months. So this give or take. The extreme would be up to 12 months, which is why we say Kaddish for up to a year. Parenthetically, many of you know that we actually don't say Kaddish for a full year. We only say Kaddish for 11 months. Right? And one of the reasons for it is, very poignantly, is that if we were to say Kaddish for a full year, it would mean that subconsciously we are entertaining the possibility that this soul is experiencing the full 12 months and it needs Kaddish. None of us ever want to assume that the soul is going through 12, because I remember 12 months is the absolute maximum. For most souls, it is far less. We say Kaddish for 11 months just to honor the soul, to recognize that we don't think that the soul is even there in Gehenna for 12 months. So we stop at 11, 1 month early of the yahrzeit, to show our confidence and our faith in our loved ones that they have already graduated before the maximum sentence. Now, there is a special connection between children, next of kin, family members who knew the individual, who can give a lift, and others. One of the great halachists, rabbinic halachists who lived also in the 13th century was a rabbi by the name of Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet. He lived from 1235 to 1310. He lived in Barcelona. He was the one of the greatest rabbi of his time. And we have over 3,000 of his responses that are still remain, of questions that were posed to him from all around the world: Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, Germany, even Asia Minor. Remember, this is the 13th century. From all over the world, people poured to him requests. And I'm going to read to you one of his responses that he writes about a question about what happens to people after they leave this world and what can we do. He writes as follows. He says, when individuals act righteously and are outstanding in their service of God, they generate tremendous merit for the souls of their parents. He says this merit is simply by virtue of their parents having served as the instruments of their birth. It is the parents who have enabled their soul to be born into this world, which in turn enabled the many righteous deeds that they perform. The parents, therefore, have a share in their meritorious acts. But then he continues, however, the truth is anyone's charity or prayers on behalf of a departed person are beneficial for the soul of the deceased. It is therefore, he says, a Jewish custom to give charity, to do other good deeds on behalf of the deceased in order to cause satisfaction to the soul. He's creating in other words, he says there's a distinction between family members and anyone. Family members don't have to do anything intentional in memory of the person. Just by their living and doing, it automatically happens. Why? Because he says in truth, parents live on through their children. The only reason why you're alive is because of your children, is because of your parents. In a sense, when you do something, he's saying, your parents are still doing it. They're acting it out through you. It's your arms, it's your legs, but it's their soul. Your soul comes from them. And so you don't have to have a special meditation to do something in memory of your loved one. The very fact that you live is a testimony that they live, because you would never have been born without them, and their soul is channeled through you. So when you do something positive, it creates satisfaction for them in the other world. Other people need to focus and think about, I'm doing this in memory of this individual. But he says, when a Jew has in mind that I'm doing it because essentially we are all one people, if I have in mind that I'm doing it in memory of this person, he says, that meditative act creates a tremendous satisfaction to the soul in the afterlife there. And as I mentioned before, while the 12 months is the maximum period of time that the soul will experience this cleansing and pressure of rehab, the yard site and the 4 times a year on Yom Kippur, Shmini Atzeret, the last day of Pesach, and on Shavuot, when we say the Yizkar and we make a commitment to give charity in memory of someone, that has a tremendous, powerful effect on the souls. Like in the meditation the rabbi was showing earlier, we are that lever. We do a small move here, it causes a tremendous reaction, a tremendous movement on the other side with our little tug here. So the next time you are thinking and we are acting, we recognize that if someone, anything that we're doing, automatically our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents are getting nachas. But we can also do it for other people. But he says we should meditate on the name and the person that we are doing it for if they are not our relative. The most auspicious times for it are the first 12 months on the yard site, and when we say Yizkar during the 4 times on the Jewish calendar. Which takes us to the Kaddish. The Kaddish, which most of us are familiar with. Obviously, you know, it does not mention death anywhere in the Kaddish. It's a proclamation of God's greatness and holiness. Its recital lifts the soul, and we're exalting God's name. And throughout our literature, it talks about the tremendous effect that Saint Kaddish has for the soul of those who have left the world. As a matter of fact, it says that no matter how deep in the process of Gehenna a soul is, when someone, especially, specifically, a family member or a child says Kaddish, it can extricate the individual from Gehenna. There is a famous story that's related in the Midrash illustrating the power, the efficacy of Kaddish. It's brought down that Rabbi Akiva, the famous Rabbi Akiva, and this is, by the way, this is one of the sources of why we teach children, even young children, God forbid, if they've lost a parent who are under bar and bat mitzvah to say Kaddish, but at any age, that the most effective thing that a child can do for their parent is saying the Kaddish. It's based upon this story that Rabbi Akiva once saw an individual running around darkened by coal dust, the dust of coal. And he was carrying an extremely heavy load of firewood on his head, and he was running around. Obviously, the story is meant to be understood that Rabbi Akiva saw this vision that happened in another world, and Rabbi Akiva tells the man to stop. And Rabbi Akiva tells him, why are you running around with such a heavy load? Are you a slave? If you're a slave, I'm going to free you right now. If you are poor and you must exert so much energy to live, I'm going to give you money right now. Please, the man pleaded with Rabbi Akiva, let me continue my work before my overlords become angry with me. Rabbi Akiva responded, what is your work? What do you do? The man replied, I am a dead man. Each day I am sent to collect wood for a giant fire, which they then cast me inside. Rabbi Akiva said, what was your occupation while you were alive in this world? The man said, I was a tax collector. I accepted bribes from the wealthy and I executed the poor. I caused the poor to be killed because I inflicted upon them and I reported them to the government. Rabbi Akiva asked him, my son, have you perhaps heard at all in heaven, in any of the other worlds that you were, that something might be done to help you, to alleviate the suffering that you're going through? Please, the man cried, leave me alone. Allow me to resume my work. My overlords are going to be angry with me and they're going to punish me even harsher. They said to me, I have no way of being redeemed. If I had a child who would stand up in synagogue and praise God by saying Kaddish, I could be released from this imprisonment and punishment. But I never had a child. When I died, I left behind a wife who was pregnant. I'm not sure if she even gave birth to a child. And if she did, there was no one who would teach my child Torah, Hebrew. I have no friend left in the world. Rabbi Akiva decided at that moment that he was going to seek out whether this man ever had a child and to teach that child. So he asked this person, this soul, tell me, what is your name? The man answered, my name is Akiva as well. What is your wife's name? Rabbi Akiva asked him. He said, my wife's name is Shoshniba. And I come from the town of Lutkia. Lutkia is from the town of Lud. You know, Lutkia is right near Tel Aviv, near the airport in Israel. Lutkia was a famous town, city in Israel. Rabbi Akiva felt extremely pained because of what he saw what the soul was experiencing. He went to that town and inquired about this individual. He started asking people in the town, have you ever heard of this man, the tax collector? And everybody told him, may his bones be ground to dust in hell. The people from the village answered him. Where's this man's wife? Rabbi Akiva inquired. The village people answered, may her memory be blotted out from this world as well. She knew everything that he did and she didn't protest. Where is this man's child? Did he ever leave? Did she ever give birth? They said, this man, he had a son. No one ever did one thing for them. The child he lives, but he's uncircumcised and no one in this town will circumcise him either. He's a total outcast. Rabbi Akiva tracked down this man's child. He circumcised him and began to teach him Torah. But the boy was unable to understand one word of Hebrew. Rabbi Akiva fasted for 40 days on this child's behalf so that God should open up his mind and his heart. Until a heavenly voice proclaimed, Rabbi Akiva, now you can start teaching this child. Rabbi Akiva taught him how to say the Shema, how to say the Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, the grace after meals, the benching. He took the child and put him in front of the congregation. He led him in prayers and the reciting of the Kaddish. That night, the soul came to Rabbi Akiva in a dream and it said, may God grant you a peaceful portion in heaven because you have spared me the punishment of hell. This is how the story ends in the Talmud. It's an unbelievable story because here we see what the three things Rabbi Akiva taught him: the Shema, the Amidah, and the grace after meals. These are the three things that are biblically mandated that we recite, right? In the Torah, it says to bless God after we eat, and to say the Shema, and to pray to Hashem. These are the three things that we have to do every single day. And Rabbi Akiva taught him, in addition to that, two things: Kaddish and how to say the Baruch Hu. And when he did that, this boy's father was released from Gehenna and was allowed to enter, finally, the Garden of Eden. So as we get toward the end of this, we're recognizing that these elements of what we call heaven and hell are not just these abstract ideas, and that one is a big party and one is a big barbecue. That these are just borrowed ideas, but what's really happening here is that the way we live our lives in this world automatically impacts how we're going to be feeling. Because if the best way I can explain is that when you enter the next world, the Talmud tells us, it's like your soul watches a video of your life played back to you in real time, and you experience the emotion, the exhilaration and the shame of all of your actions. The Talmud says that what's really happening, what hell really is the experience of how you behaved and the shame that you feel that you could have done and should have done differently. And heaven is the experience of the good that you did in this world, and the realization that it means, and it meant so much more than we could have ever imagined in this world. That little lever that we pushed in life, that we said, how significant is it really? When we come to heaven, we realize how significant every mitzvah is. The same thing is true. Every transgression, every time we deviate from the Torah, it may seem like a small thing. Who cares? Who's paying attention? God has so much to worry about. God has a lot on his plate. Who's paying really attention? The truth is, everything that we do, we're pulling a lever that's moving a boulder, a mountain on the other side. And when we come to the other world, we finally see, we come face to face with what those acts really, really accomplished. And so it's the consequence of it that we are experiencing. In other words, heaven and hell is not a reaction. I spent a lot of time in the intro explaining that it's not a reaction, it's not a gift or a punishment. It's a direct cause of what we've done, that what we will experience in the other world, the afterlife, is the actual planting, reaping, harvest. A equals B equals C. It's not that we've done something and we're going to be standing waiting around for a court to convene and saying, what do we have here? Let us discuss what should we do with this individual. That is not the essence of what's really going on. We are automatically becoming the recipient of our actions in this world. Now, if that is the case, it highlights then how important our mission in this world really is, because the afterlife is not just a time that we're going to be evaluated and then punished or rewarded, because that's, as I said, that is not really what's going to happen. It's going to be a direct cause and effect experience that tells us the urgency that every act that we do, that we are divine operatives in this world, and that what we do, that what we do here is going to be what we experience during that time. And so I want to leave, before we conclude, with the final summary. Even though the purpose of this class is to discuss on the heavy matters that lie beyond our view, the afterlife, Gan Eden, Gehenna, it is critical for us to walk away after this is all over, not to be so focused or overly focused on what is yet to come. What is yet to come is yet to come. We need to be focused on what we can do now that is still determining what's going to happen at that time. So our current universe of tangible materiality. So I want to give you something to think about before you walk away. And so imagine this. Imagine you are a medical researcher who spends many years in a lab And miraculously, you succeed in finding a cure for the most unbelievable cure that we've all, as a society and as a civilization, have been looking for. Imagine you find the cure for something that magically cures cancer, all cancers. With this one discovery, all the suffering and pain of countless millions of people is finally alleviated. Imagine the Nobel Prize Committee hears of this discovery. They wait to confirm that this dreaded disease has truly been eradicated, and that in fact this is a discovery worthy of the highest honor in the field of medicine. You receive an invitation to come to Sweden with your family and friends to receive the coveted award at a magnificent ceremony. It's perfectly natural that this researcher who discovered this cure should be awarded this prize. There is no one else on the planet more deserving. But yet, for this researcher, receiving an award in Sweden, the Nobel Prize, is going to be something of anticlimactic. Because what prize can a person receive in this world that would ever compare to the excitement of that moment of realizing that you've discovered a cure to save millions of people? The thrill when you've realized that single-handedly, you're ending some of the worst suffering our world has ever known. After you experience something this important, the memory of the accomplishment can feel good. But even more significant is the quality to be engaged in the work itself. I use this as a metaphor to explain that when we do something, when we're engaged in the most important work, we are all divine researchers in this lab called Earth that God put us in to find cures through the way we live. Of course, reward, it feels good to be acknowledged. Of course, we all want to get invited and we all want to win the Nobel Prize. But the truth is, knowing that what we're doing is saving the world, because every individual is a universe, the Talmud tells us. He who saves one person saves the world. Save yourself. The way we live our lives is so consequential that to discuss what is the reward for doing that, while that might be a nice distraction, we should realize nothing comes close to when someone actually gets to that level of achievement. There is no reward that's going to ever feel commensurate with saving our planet. What am I going to do? I'm going to save the planet, and they're going to give me a bust of some kind of statue to put on my mantelpiece. And every now and then I look at it and I remember what I did. That's a nice feeling. But I know that I can go back into the lab and I can save another person and another person. There's nothing more gratifying. There's nothing more rewarding than that. This is how we have to look at life. Rather than only being focused on what is our reward going to be in the afterlife? What is the consequence going to be? What do I get for it? That's like asking a scientist who's hard at work at something, when you come up with the discovery, you're going to be celebrated. We're going to reward you. They'll smile at you and they'll say, that's wonderful. When it happens, it'll happen. But that's certainly not why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. That's the work itself is the greatest reward. And this is how we have to look at while we are here, knowing that we will get there. But what we are doing now is the greatest gift that we have, because when we get to that next world, it's going to be looking backwards, recognizing that what we did here is what creates our heaven and what creates our hell. Depending on how we live our life here, that is in great measure the experience we're going to be feeling in the other world until the resurrection happens. The next two classes after tonight deal with two very logical extensions of this, because we're going through this chronologically. After the afterlife, we're going to be discussing the idea of reincarnation in Judaism. What happens after that stage? Do we come back? Why do we need to come back if we've completed our mission. And the last stage after reincarnation is resurrection, which means after the soul leaves the body, the soul comes back again. Is there ever a purpose? And why is resurrection such a fundamental belief in Judaism called Tchiyat HaMeitim that we recite in our prayers every single day, where the body and soul then come back for a grand reunion again? And so as we go through each of these stages, we are recognizing that we, not to fear, not to be apprehensive, each of these stages was always predetermined. We all started in a womb. We all started in utero, afraid of coming out into the world. We come out from that birth, then recognizing, then we get stuck in this world, afraid of the next progression, the next birth. But by acknowledging that we were all afraid to be born the first time, yes, maybe we'll be afraid to be born again, but to have the peace of mind and of spirit of knowing that the first birth was a struggle, but it allowed us to become alive and independent of our mothers, so to right, as an individual. And while that separation is harsh at the beginning, but is the greatest gift that we are given, so too the next stage is also a birth. It's a rebirth, and that we should understand that it's not a cessation. It's not a retardation going backwards. It's an ever marching forward progression of a new reality, a new birth, and that that eventually we're going to make that full circle and recognize why each stage was necessary for that evolution. Let us conclude with
Lesson 4. Where we go. 1. God's rewards and punishments are natural consequences of our actions. 2. When we do mitzvot, we forge an intimate relationship with God. In the afterlife, our souls experience the effects of our actions, our relationship with God. This is the greatest possible pleasure, and is also known as paradise, Gan Eden. 3. At times, a soul cannot enter paradise immediately, for its inappropriate actions in this world diminished its capacity to experience spiritual pleasures. Gehenna, a painful yet cleansing process, is temporary. Every soul ultimately reaches paradise. 4. In Gan Eden, the soul constantly ascends to higher levels. Good deeds performed in a person's memory, including the recital of Kaddish, elevate the soul to higher levels that it cannot attain on its own. 5. What we do here and now is more important than the pleasures or pain of the afterlife. Living in order to receive rewards in the next world, or to avoid heavenly punishment, distracts our focus from where it belongs, increasing goodness and godliness in this world.
Okay, my friends, I'm gonna open it up if anybody wants to say anything or ask anything. For those who want to bid farewell because they're so focused in their life mission, they don't want to waste any more time, and we want to get back to Jewish living until we shall reconvene again later in the week. Thank you all very, very much. Again, next Monday evening, we will be discussing the topic of reincarnation and how Kabbalah understands this transition and what happens, why it's necessary, and what really happens when we come back again. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
So a lot to
Yeah.
ponder.
Yeah.
A lot to ponder.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
I do have one quick question. Can you give me what's the distinguish for Sheol? Is that the afterlife or is that the grave?
I'm sorry?
Sheol, is that referring to the afterlife or to the grave?
Sheol? The Hebrew word Sheol?
Yes.